Most of us are familiar with the story of the civil rights movement in the Deep South, familiar with the story of Martin Luther King and the march across the bridge at Selma. We're familiar with Birmingham. We're familiar with Little Rock. We're familiar with the lunch counter sit-ins. We're less familiar with events in Los Angeles. Um, and it becomes much more clear when we look at the struggle against economic injustice and the struggle against police brutalization within the Watts ghetto, um, where the violent, explosive energy, the rage that pours forth in the mid 1960s comes from. And this is after the initial successes of the early civil rights era. So, in this podcast today, we're going to explore the origins and the causes of the Watts Riot. Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. And this is the first time I'm using a completely new um, recording system. I've had a few days where I've had some nightmares with my previous recording setup. I'm not going to malign um, the software provider. It wouldn't be fair. But suffice to say, there's been a bit of an interruption of service, and that's why. So, as you guys always do, any feedback issues at all, I'm happy to hear them. Let me know if this is agony on your ears at all. Okay, so today I'm going to be mainly talking about the Watts riots of 1965. And we're going to be looking at Set the Night on Fire, the book I've referenced several times before, by Mike Davis and John Wiener. Um, and the Watts and their aftermath tell us a huge amount about the treatment of African Americans in the mid 1960s, and also the kind of the structural and economic injustices that were heaped upon communities like Watts, um, and the kind of the hidden segregations, not the Jim Crow of the South, but something equally pernicious, kind of an economic and a more invisible Jim Crow in places like Los Angeles. 1965 will be the longest and hottest and bloodiest year of them all. It has to be, not because you want it to be, or I want it to be, or we want it to be, but because the conditions that created these explosions in 1963 are still here. The conditions that created explosions in 64 are still here. Brothers and sisters, let me tell you, I spend my time out there in the street with the people, all kind of people, listening to what they have to say, and they're dissatisfied, they're disillusioned, they're fed up, they're getting to the point of frustration where they're beginning to feel, what do they have to lose? Malcolm X gave this speech in Detroit on February the 14th, 1965, 2 weeks after a high-speed escape from would-be Nation of Islam assassins in Los Angeles, and a week before he was murdered in Harlem. He was often prescient, but what he was hearing on the streets could have been heard by almost anyone who bothered to listen in Black America, including the streets of the South LA district of Watts. In the 1960s, the reaction against the relative successes of the civil rights movement and the attempts by state governments, particularly, to overturn progressive measures in housing, employment, education, and other aspects of the desegregation movement, had raised temperatures, had made outbreaks of mass anger and protest more likely. But the authors point out, the big factor for the Watts uprising was what they call the economic flytrap, snared the lives and the hopes of black youth, particularly in the older, poorer half of the ghetto east of the Harbour Freeway. This area, including Watts, was a principal focus of an unprecedented study of hardcore unemployment and poverty published in December 1965 by two veteran researchers at UCLA's Institute of Industrial Relations, Paul Bullock and Fred Schmidt, with former Freedom Rider Robert Singleton as their chief research assistant. The institute, staffed by visionary faculty such as Ben Aaron, Art Carstens, Irving Bernstein, and Fred Mayers, acted as a think tank for the Los Angeles labor movement, working closely with figures like Paul Schrade and John T. Williams of the Teamsters. Its famed labor education program trained hundreds of shop stewards and lower-ranked union officials. Bullock, a labor economist, was the institute's point man in South Central LA, and a much respected figure, especially in Watts, where he spent more than a decade conducting interviews with youth in the projects and eventually published a unique book, Watts, The Aftermath, an inside view of the ghetto by the people of Watts, in which he acted as an amanuensis for community voices. His commitment to the community was profound after the 1965 rebellion, particularly irksome to politicians and poverty bureaucrats making false claims about the success of job training schemes in the Watts area. The Hardcore Unemployment Report studied a spectrum of affected groups in an area that included East Side, South Central, Skid Row, and a concentration of elderly white poor, displaced by the Bunker Hill renewal around MacArthur Park. Some of the findings were predictable. For instance, the overcrowding of male job seekers, black and brown, in a few available niches, particularly construction labour. Others were more surprising and counterintuitive, such as the fact that long-established ghetto residents were with relatively high educational achievement, 11th grade versus 9th grade for the whole study area, were more likely to suffer joblessness than newer, less educated arrivals from the South. There were lots of African Americans coming from the southern states to California in the 1960s, fleeing Jim Crow and looking for new opportunities. Or the discovery that the black poor got at least as much income support from extended families, fellow churchgoers, and neighbours as they did from county welfare and federal aid. The most striking finding, however, was that the 60% unemployment rate among black women needing to work outside the home. The burden of long-term unemployment falls heavily upon Negro women, who suffer from a lack of available jobs and a necessity, in many cases, to support excessively large households. The survey found that 2/3 of all long-term unemployed women were younger than 40, but that the age barrier was particularly formidable for Negro women who have lived in the state for 10 years or more. 3/4 of these older women were the heads of households.
Instacart helps you get what you need fast. Like when the watch party at your place finally makes it out of the group chat. Suddenly you need snacks, drinks, and all the things nobody planned for. With Instacart, you can get groceries and party essentials delivered. Just download the app, place your order, and it shows up in as fast as 30 minutes. That way, hosting feels easy and looks like you had a plan all along. Get the Instacart app today and get game day deals.
Just to give you a kind of a perspective of the way in which I think civil rights and the struggle for freedoms for African Americans is understood and taught, or historically has been understood and taught here in the UK. A lot is made of the 1950s civil rights era, Little Rock, and Montgomery, and that kind of thing. And then a lot is made of the early civil rights era, of the March on Washington and Birmingham and Selma, and the I Have a Dream speech. Then it becomes more sort of complex and diffuse, and there's the assassination of Martin Luther King, and then there's an exploration of the Black Power movement, and it's traditionally that's kind of it. And obviously, I've talked about this before a lot about my kind of my view of the deficiency of all of this. And looking at Watts today, I think part of it is that we don't look at economic injustice. Exploring civil rights in its rawest form is kind of a kind of liberalism's sort of take on all of this, of the struggle for legal equality, the struggle for educational equality, the struggle for the desegregation of public spaces, which, you know, if you think about kind of liberalism and its kind of ideological and kind of economic basis, liberalism is about the enshrining of a kind of a rules-based capitalism, a capitalism which ensures some sort of legalism, some sort of basis in kind of constitutionalism, but it's not socialism. It's not about the redistribution of wealth and power, which I think is a working definition of what socialism is. In many ways, liberalism is one of the more kind of powerful tools that the kind of a capitalist order has. And so, when we look at the civil rights movement, focusing, in a capitalist society where capitalist norms are taught, focusing on the idea, and it's a mistaken idea, that at the end of the civil rights movement, somehow everything was kind of better because everyone has a nice level playing field, so that they can exist in capitalist modernity together, irrespective of skin color. That ignores huge inequalities and injustices and economic ones. And so that's why when one examines, I mean, the classic kind of experience of teaching and learning, the period of the kind of the riots in the mid 1960s was what is kind of one of bemusement of, well, why were they doing that then? Wasn't all that resolved, and you can see kind of pedagogically why we reached that point. So, Tom Wiener and Mike Davis Wright. In other studies, Bullock used a thick ethnographic approach to analyse the situation of young jobless males in Watts and elsewhere in the ghetto. His work highlighted the destructive roles of segregated education and the LAPD's stop and frisk policies. Black arrivals from the South, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas, and Alabama, in order of numbers, bore the scars of a wretched Jim Crow education, and some were completely unlettered. There was no public program to address their need for remedial instruction and vocational education. Neighborhood youth who'd grown up in the LA school system, by contrast, were generally literate but dropped out of their underfunded high schools at rates ranging from 40 to 70%. In one paper, Bullock argued that many dropouts were actually kickouts, the victims of administrative policies that compelled students to transfer or leave for offences no more serious than learning problems, or in one case, a single truancy. Meanwhile, the LAPD operated the nation's most successful negative employment scheme, while giving low priority to white-collar crimes. Whatever their impact on society, the department fastened a relentless dragnet on poor black and Chicano neighborhoods. Without the slightest pretense of probable cause, the cops stopped and searched people, particularly young men, in the hope of finding some weed or a stolen item. Those who verbally defended themselves, however innocent, could usually be offered a ride to jail. The result was an extraordinary accumulation of petty arrests, but not necessarily convictions, that made a majority of young men unemployable. Thus stigmatized, youth entered the street economy, where they sold drugs, practiced petty theft, and inevitably earned further, more serious arrest records. Even in a booming economy, in June 1965, manufacturing employment and wages broke all peacetime records. There was no route to employment for a large minority of young black men, except through minimum wage job schemes that paid far less than selling pot or fencing goods from the trunk of a car. So in this analysis, kind of poverty, exclusion, marginalization, and criminalization are all manufactured. They are all the products of kind of state intervention in the kind of the crudest and rawest of ways.
This is Ndamukong Suh from the No Free Lunch podcast. Ever feel like your workload is out of control? Like you're wearing every hat and expected to be everywhere at once? Running a business means juggling books, payments, leads, payroll, basically everything. But with Intuit QuickBooks, your workload gets unloaded. QuickBooks gives you access to Intuit's powerful AI agents and trusted human experts who work together to handle the tedious stuff so you can get back to what actually grows your business. And because everything's streamlined on one platform, your customer management, accounting, expenses, and payroll all work seamlessly in one place. So go ahead, outdo it with Intuit QuickBooks. Get 50% off QuickBooks Online for 3 months. Terms and conditions apply. Feature availability may vary by product. Visit QuickBooks.com for details.
Instacart helps you get what you need fast. Like when the watch party at your place finally makes it out of the group chat. Suddenly you need snacks, drinks, and all the things nobody planned for. With Instacart, you can get groceries and party essentials delivered. Just download the app, place your order, and it shows up in as fast as 30 minutes. That way, hosting feels easy and looks like you had a plan all along. Get the Instacart app today and get game day deals.
In a society that isn't part of the Deep South, isn't part of the former Confederacy, and yet the kind of the means by which of racial segregation are very acute. In California, you have a racialized police force in the guise of the LAPD that was then and subsequently always has been a tool for enforcing a kind of unofficial Jim Crow. And I think that's actually what you see in Watts. It is the kind of the unofficial Jim Crow. Paul Jacobs, a reporter activist who went on to help found Mother Jones magazine, brilliantly illustrated Bullock's vicious circle in an exchange with a staff member on the McCone Commission investigating the rebellion. This is obviously the McCone Commission happened afterwards, and we'll talk about that another time, but it was an embarrassing whitewash. He was asked, what do you think is the most important bar to minority employment that could be eliminated quickly? The handicap that would be the easiest to wipe out is the arrest record, Jacobs answered. If arrest records weren't held against people, you could probably change the employment situation overnight, but a hell of a lot of people to work. The staffer, a former prosecutor, glared at Jacobs. I don't think a man who's got an arrest record should be employed in most businesses. I wouldn't hire anyone who had an arrest record for my family's business. the problem in a nutshell. Meanwhile, progress on the fair employment front was slight, to say the least. In July, Times Labour reporter Harry Bernstein applauded gains by black Americans in the aerospace industry, but acknowledged that smaller companies, those with 400 or fewer workers, seem to have made no significant effort to end the whites-only hiring policies. Moreover, the top-level management attitudes, which now seem to oppose racial discrimination, are often not reflected at the lower management level, which is where workers are actually hired. Don Smith, the new head of CORE, the Commission on Racial Equality, scorned the pervasive game among employers of paying lip service to fair employment while continuing their old discriminatory hiring practices. 5 years ago, we would go to an employer who was discriminating, and either he would agree to try and correct the situation or he would chase us out. Today, almost nobody chases us out, but they make promises of reform which are never kept. I prefer open discrimination to this kind of hypocrisy. Another major obstacle to addressing the unemployment problem was Mayor Yorty's stubborn refusal to accept federal guidelines that would have released millions of dollars of anti-poverty funds for youth jobs. In April 1964, backed up by the UNRWA camp and the downtown establishment, he went scorned. Yorty was re-elected in a landslide over Congressman Jimmy Roosevelt, FDR's war hero's son, and the candidate of Governor Brown and the California Democratic clubs. It was a double victory since Ros Wyman, his bête noir on the city council, was also defeated. But perhaps the most profound consequence of the election was that it freed Yorty from dependence on black voters and their concerns. His inner racist was now given full scope. The election effectively created a ruling triumvirate of white power in Los Angeles: Chief Parker, Mayor Yorty, and Cardinal McIntyre. The Federal War on Poverty's new Office of Economic Opportunity, headed by Sergeant Shriver, had allocated millions for job programs in LA, but it came with the stipulation that the poor themselves, through open elections or town meetings, had to be represented on the required umbrella agency. Yorty, refusing to yield any power to Washington or local civil rights leaders, was unmoved by his insistence that he alone should have the power to appoint members of such a board. Los Angeles thus became the only major city in the United States, Shriver declared in August 1965, that has failed to organize effectively local anti-poverty programs. Everywhere else in America, almost without exception, elected officials have been extremely helpful. As a result, a summer program that would have organized recreation for 20,000 LA teenagers was cancelled, and several thousand youth jobs, the funding already budgeted by the OEO, were left in limbo. Summer 1965, as Robert Cano later wrote in his account of the August uprising, was the worst ever, one of chaos, disunity, and suspicion, as no jobs had materialized. Kids lounged around getting high on cheap wine and marijuana, discussing amongst themselves which white motherfuckers and Uncle Toms were making a killing on the anti-poverty program. So there you go. Riots have contexts. I'll do a thing probably later this week on the riot itself and the role of the LAPD and the kind of extraordinary violence against the people of Watts. And essentially extrajudicial killings that happen. Riots don't, obviously, I mean, it seems like an obvious thing to say, but it's only an obvious thing to say based on what we're talking about here. And frequently this is actually never really said, that explosions of public anger have social and economic roots, so social and economic determinants, and they are ways in which inchoate and violent ways in which people express frustrations and desperation. and so they are portrayed as the kind of the anger of the kind of the incoherent mob, but it's often more complex than that. And we obviously, here on the podcast, we're always striving for as much nuance as we can possibly get. So I'm going to leave you there in just a moment. Before I do, I just want to let you know that on the 15th of this month, 15th of February, I'm going to be doing a second masterclass. So I'm going to be doing one on the USA from 1945 to 1974, from Truman through to Nixon. And we'll be looking at the boom era in America, the counterculture, Watergate, and the civil rights movement in a bit of a whistle stop tour, and we're going to be focusing on essay ideas and skills too. So please join us for that. I'll post a link in the notes below. I'll catch you on the next Explaining History podcast, and until then, take good care. All the best. Bye bye.
Dear McDonald's, your breakfast menu? Fire. 10s across the board. I could be happy with anything, even though I ordered the same thing every time. Thanks for not judging me. I'll try something new next time. Maybe.
Score a 2 for $5 deal on a sausage McMuffin with egg and more. Limited time only. Price and participation may vary. Cannot be combined with any other offer. Single item at regular price.
Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Explaining History. This podcast is an independent production, and it's listener support that keeps these conversations going week after week. If you find value in the show and want to help cover the costs of research and production, please consider making a contribution. You can join our community on Patreon or make a one-off donation. Just follow the links in the show notes for this episode. Every bit of support is truly appreciated. Thanks again for listening.